So our speaker is John van Oudenaren. He is a global fellow at the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He directed the World Digital Library Project at the Library of Congress from 2005 to 2018. Previously, he was chief of the European Division at the Library of Congress and a researcher at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Dr. van Oudenaren holds a PhD in political science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an AB in Germanic languages and literatures from Princeton University. He is the author of numerous books and articles on European affairs, international politics, and digital libraries. Dr. John van Oudenaren on Skype for us. Over to you.
Good afternoon to you. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you at your conference, but for various reasons I couldn't. But I'm delighted to be able to speak about World Digital Library and some of the lessons that were learned or possibly not learned by the library community, the technology community, that may be relevant for this very ambitious and admirable effort that you're putting forward in creating a national digital library of India. I think you have in your brochure an introductory section to the written paper that I've provided. As you see, I start my paper by quoting from a story in the Washington Post that appeared when the Library of Congress, way back in 2007, showed at UNESCO in Paris prototype of the digital library. And the story, the headline in the Post read, quote, "Checking out tomorrow's library, parents and internet working group goes off site for a multi-language school, intellectual cathedral of digital knowledge." And I looked at on this phrase, intellectual cathedral, put it in the Indian intellectual, and really focus on the question of how a library becomes intellectual cathedral, and that how it's fallen short. Now, the phrase intellectual cathedral is not from the journalist who wrote the story, from Paul Saft, who is a prominent Silicon Valley technology forecaster, and he was asked to quote this for release. And he wrote, said, historic instance, what we're doing is intellectual cathedral, and it may never get finished. But this is a good effort, even if it fails, because it is going to inspire other efforts. If it succeeds, it will be a wonderful story. Challenges here aren't technological. For me, the issue is will they make it happen? Will to make it happen. Well, will they seek this? So, I wanted to key off this issue and about the idea of intellectual cathedral and seeing it through. Now, here that the digital effort has succeeded. I regret this because I spent 12 years of my life, but the project is persisted. There's no further on it. It still is online, unique.org, but there's no further work being done on it. And Princeton Institute are squished in the same place. The question is, but the important point is not really the fate of that particular project. Let me say a little bit about the origins of the project. The project was launched in the early 2000s, and it was at the time the idea was to reach the end user. This is again in the early 2000s. It's in post 9/11 environment. And very much wanted to reach an end user uh, ordered, uh, ordered to promote international understanding. That was the vision. It was a highly idealistic vision, but the idea was if we could have people in India, in China, in the Islamic world, in the Western world, seeing each other's cultures and seeing what was best in each other's cultures, this would promote international peace and international understanding. So we had a very strong focus on the end user, not reaching, and by end user, we meant young people in internet cafes or on their phones, not scholars, not librarians, not researchers. So that was our focus. And the political environment for this at the time was very good. We had China working very closely with us. The National Library of China wanted to be involved in this. France, after the Iraq War, France wanted to patch up relations with the United States. And so the French became very positive about the project. And we also had very good relations with Silicon Valley. This was a period in which there was a lot of high hopes about partnership between Silicon Valley and the cultural world. And I personally participated in many meetings with Sergey Brin, the founder of Google, where he discussed with Dr. Billington, the Librarian of Congress, how we would work together to build this intellectual cathedral. So that's a little bit of the background to how the project got started. I'll just say that the international environment is now very different. Without going into a political speech, you know, we have a lot more tension in the world. There's obviously, as you followed, there's a lot of bad relations between China and the U.S. But most importantly, I think things have changed with Silicon Valley. It's very difficult to build cultural cooperation between the Library of Congress or any library and cultural institution and Silicon Valley. They've kind of gone off on their own. They've built their own platforms. I don't think they feel they need the library and the museum and archive community to the extent to which they once did. They've kind of moved on. So let me say a little bit about how we attempted to accomplish these goals that we set for ourselves. We had three things that we wanted to build into this World Digital Library site. And if you go to the site, wdl.org, you will see those things. The first was multilingualism. We wanted the site to be multilingual, so we created a website that functions in 7 languages, the 6 official UN languages, which are, as you probably know, Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian, Spanish, and English. And also we added Portuguese because we were working with the National Library of Portugal. Our hope over time was to add Hindi and other South Asian and Southeast Asian languages. If you take the official UN languages plus Portuguese, you get a very large percentage of the world's population can be covered, with the exception of South Asia, where you do have languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people that are not official UN languages for whatever reason. So we had hoped to add them over time. But the key was to have a multilingual website and to have very high quality multilingualism. We were aiming to what we called for an equivalent user experience in each of the 7 languages. The second feature that we tried to build into the project was universality. We wanted universal participation by all countries, and we wanted to have content from and about every country in the world. Now, this was a very ambitious undertaking. It's something that UNESCO urged us to do, that we worked with UNESCO on. The challenge here was capacity building. There are 193 nations in the world, independent countries. I would guess that 2/3 of them have absolutely no capability to really participate in a digital library project of this kind. They're too small, they're too poor, they don't have the technology or whatever. So we did engage in some capacity building efforts. We purchased digitization equipment for libraries in Iraq, in Egypt, in Africa. We conducted workshops and so on, and we did a bit to promote universality. But this is something that we fell short of getting full. Universal participation. This is something for the future of the international library community that yet needs to be worked on. And then the third thing, and probably the most important thing that we tried to build into this project, was quality. We were aiming for that end user experience. We knew we were going to be competing with Facebook and YouTube and all these new things that were coming along then. So we wanted to make this site highly functional with very high quality. So if you look at the site, you see we have a careful selection of content. We had an international committee that was established in Egypt of scholars who worked to pick the most important and interesting items. We aimed for a very high quality metadata, a standard set of Dublin Core metadata for every single item in the digital library. We wanted to have powerful Zoom capabilities. Curation was very important for every single item in the World Digital Library, every book, every map, every photograph or photograph album. We wanted to have a description written by a curator or an expert in which we would explain what is this thing and why does it matter. So the idea here was to bring high culture or all culture, complicated culture, but bring it to the average person. Not talk down to them, but not use academic jargonistic language the way scholars use, but to really explain to the average user, okay, here's a beautiful manuscript from 12th century Europe or 14th century Egypt or 8th century China. It's beautiful, it's interesting. You can't read it, of course, because it's not in your language. But what is it? What are the illustrations show, and so forth? So that was curation was very important. And then last but not least, we were aiming for very high performance. And this was now this is a long time ago, of course, and things have moved on. But even to this day, we still have pretty high performance. We were aiming for that 1.1 per second load time all over the world. We conducted studies. We used the CDN, a content delivery network. And we migrated very early to the cloud to try to get that very rapid response time all over the world. So those were the three features that we wanted to build into the site. One, multilingualism. Two, universality of participation and content. And three, very high performance. And performance was both technical or very high quality. And quality meant both curation, selection of content, and technical performance. So that's what we aim to do. Now, what we were driven to, because of those requirements, was a so-called centralized site. Now you all know there are portal sites which basically send people to content that is hosted at various institutions. We early on rejected that model. We didn't think it would work for a project that was going to be getting content from all over the world. It would be too slow. So we opted for a site that was more centralized. Now, what we meant by that was we were going to use a system of mirrors, and the plan was to have 6 or 7 mirror sites around the world to improve performance. But have a central site, of course, that would populate the mirrors every night or however often was required. We abandoned that model because it was overtaken by technology. As soon as the cloud came in and content delivery networks came in, we didn't see that there was much value added anymore in having 6 or 7 mirrors. when you could distribute the content to, at that time, Akamai, this is already in 2009, Akamai had 45,000 servers around the world. So we abandoned the mirror concept. We still were trying, and to some extent we made some progress on this, but this is the great challenge. This is the great challenge, and I'm sure it's the challenge you face in India as well. We were trying to create a decentralized model of content creation and content processing that would lead to this homogenization of content. See, what my view of digital libraries is that they must be a tool that mediates between the heterogeneity in which cultural institutions store and catalog and present their content, and the homogeneity that end users expect. When people go to Facebook, when they go to YouTube, when they go to Instagram, wherever they go, it always looks exactly the same. And that's what they are expecting from a digital library project. The problem is cultural institutions store, both in the analog form but also in the digital form when they start digitizing, they present things, they catalog things, they organize things in very heterogeneous ways. So what the digital library needs to do is become a homogenizing force. Now that's very difficult to do, and this gets to my lessons learned. We had a great deal of difficulty. It was a challenge. It was an interesting challenge. We had a great deal of difficulty in getting distributed libraries all over the world. We had partners from more than 60 countries, getting them to homogenize their content to the standard. And I give the example in the paper that we had a range of metadata. The best metadata we got in terms of quality were these beautiful XML files or MARC files, which everything was perfect, using authority files, descriptions provided, and so on. That was the best metadata we got. The worst piece of metadata I ever got for the project was a cell phone JPEG file sent via text message of index card in Arabic from an institution in the Middle East, and that was the metadata they sent. So we had this range. We had, and what we were trying to do was create a system whereby everybody would use online tools and homogenize their metadata. We never really solved that problem, and I think that's a problem for the future that digital libraries have to tackle, both on the national level, cooperative digital libraries on the national level, but on the global levels. How you get decentralized institutions to follow systems where you homogenize the data more, so that it can be presented in the way end users like to see it. So one of the problems that we ran into, or I don't know, probably this option to create use a centralized architecture like this had both pluses and minuses. Pluses, it led to very heavy usage. World Digital Library is, despite the fact that it is a fairly small body of content, it only has 20,000 items in it. World Digital Library is quite heavily used as digital library projects go. We've had 70 million users since the launch. It gets more than 20,000 users a day from all over the world. Multilingualism, interestingly, ended up being an interesting example. When we set up the site in the 7 different languages, we didn't really know which one would be used the most, and we sort of just assumed that English would be the most heavily used. But in reality, that was not true. Spanish became the #1 language, English second. Initially, Arabic and Chinese were very far behind, but they grew. And by the final years of the project, we had actually kind of achieved a fairly balanced profile where we were getting very heavy usage, several thousand people a day in all 7 of these languages. So that was the positive side of the centralized architecture, a huge number of inbound links. We had more than 5 million links at one point from Wikipedia pages, from blogs, from university courses, lots of things that were sending people to, lots of sites were sending people to World Digital Library, and that was increasing usage, and that was making the site, reaching these end users. The negative side of the centralized architecture, to be blunt about it, is I don't think it ever got buy-in from the international library community. For whatever reason, or certainly not the American library community, let's put it that way. For whatever reason, and you can have your own discussions about this, but for whatever reason, the international library community is very deeply committed to this decentralized portal model. I'm not a librarian and I'm not a technologist, so I don't really speak about this from a position of great authority, but it always mystified me somewhat that at exactly the time when Silicon Valley was building massive server farms up in Oregon by the hydroelectric power, and then all around the world to concentrate and homogenize as much data as they could, whether it was Facebook or LinkedIn or Google or Google Book Search or all these massive bodies of data that the commercial world was concentrating there, which has now even become controversial politically, as why these private companies control so much data, including personal data about people and so on. Why, as they were doing that, the library community seemed to be moving in exactly the opposite direction and was stubbornly committed to the only model we really are keen on, is one which aggregates metadata but keeps the content distributed. And again, and the effective distribution again is not decentralization per se, but it's this lack of homogeneity. It's the heterogeneous nature of this content, which I think puts off users. It's one of the reasons that drives down usage, one of the factors that drives down usage, and it also makes these projects intellectually a great deal less interesting. Now, I say in my paper, I'm fairly critical of these portal models because I think they don't really reach the end user. I give the example of the Digital Public Library of America, which gets which maybe gets about 5,000 users a day, but has more than 30 million items on it. And I point out that if people looked, if each user looked at one item, it would take 30 years for each individual item to be looked at even once. So I think these projects are not really used very much. And now that's criticizing the portal projects. Let me direct criticism at myself at World Digital Library. That's the problem with the portal projects. I think they're huge aggregations of metadata, but they don't provide enough value added, starting with homogeneity, to attract the users. But to be self-critical about World Digital Library, our problem was the opposite. We provided a lot of value added, a lot of quality, but not enough quantity. And we had a very small volume of content. And I believe, and this is my intellectual tempo. Yeah, I'll finish. So I think the future is going to be who can make a combination of high quality and high quantity. That's going to be the challenge. And I can actually end right there. I think that's what you need to be focusing on in creating an Indian digital library. How do you combine the quality and performance that something like World Digital Library has with the quantity and numbers that some of these international portal projects have? And I would just say a couple things about how you do that. I think you need to recognize the importance of this heterogeneity, homogeneity thing. Architecture, inherent, as they say in English, the issue is not centralized versus decentralized architecture. The issue is how you move from the heterogeneity of content that institutions hold to the homogeneity that end users expect. That's number one. Number two, I would suggest that we need to involve a broad range of people in building digital libraries, not just a digital librarian, not just librarians who come at it from a particular point of view, very heavily focused on metadata. We need to focus more on getting people focused on the end users involved. I would say don't chase numbers for the sake of chasing numbers. I was at a meeting where somebody talked about, we're going to create a digital library with 1 billion records. Honestly, I don't see that there's any demand in the public anywhere for a metadata aggregation of 1 billion records. I personally think it's not useful. And then last but not least, pay attention to the end user. I think that's the key to all digital library projects. That's what we try to do, and I'll end right there. Thank you.
Thanks, the speaker. Yeah, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you, John. On behalf of NDLI, I'm sorry that you had to wake up a little earlier and had to wait because we are running a little late, and then the audio visual problems. So we have time for just a quick question. It has to be very short and very quick.
Hi, John. This is Partho. Really appreciate taking this special effort for us. Your paper has been set in a nice way as a PDF and will be available to all the audience here. And thank you very much. There'll be probably 1 or 2 questions that the chair will offer you.
Thank you, Professor PPD. Any quick questions? Okay. I had a question, but in the interest of time, we'll have to move on. Thank you, John. I'll possibly follow up with you via email and maybe even in person in the DC area. Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. So the last part of our session, certainly not the least, will be led by Professor Plavan Bhumik. And this is student presentations. So, Plavan, you want to come up? Oh, she's